tales that terrify. As the night shadows multiply, we got chills, we got thrills, they're hunting you. Tales of dread from the dead, the masters do. Wicked dreams, muffled screams, all coming true. SL tonight.
Greetings, wanderers of the dark, to SL Tonight, Tales that Terrify. With shadows shifting, we sidestep the deeper abysses of Night Visions 3 for a safer double dip into Ramsey Campbell's subtle chills. First, in the trees, where the forest holds more than branches. Then, the guide, leading you astray into unknown dread. We are currently here at WJUL Radio and Lounge, and we are listening. So let the whispers begin. The rail fall saw the aftermath of the crash as he slowed for the detour. Beyond the police cars and their orange barrier, smoke veined with flames smudged the gray sky. Breaking, he thought of matches a child had been playing with, matches spilled from a box. There were telephone poles that had fallen from a lorry, blocking both westbound lanes of the motorway and smashing a car. He hoped the driver had got out before the car caught fire, hoped the police had recorded his own speed before he had seen them. He cruised past them off the motorway off his planned route. He was already late for his next town, the next load of unpopular books. He stopped in at a parking area with a padlocked toilet and a bin surrounded by litter and dug out his road atlas from among the week's newspapers. It looked as if the most direct route was through the green blotch on the map and the horizon pines. He swung onto the road with a screech of gravel. The road plowed through the flat landscape, past stubbly fields relieved only by a couple of derelict farmhouses and rusty scraps of cars, and the forest seemed no easier to reach than the blob of sun in the sky. When at last he came to the forest, he had to drive alongside for miles, until he began to suspect that the road through was closed. No, here it was, and he braked fiercely as he turned. The trees cut off the sunlight, such as it was, at once. He hadn't realized the road would be so gloomy. He might have felt the trees were closing their ranks against him, and his van load of books, pulped wood on the way to be pulped again, books returned by the bookshops because they were too late for the fads they'd been written to cater to. Still, he hadn't supposed butchers felt uneasy driving meat past animals. He switched on his headlights and was picking up speed when the children walked into the road. The side of the coach parked by the road must have alerted him, for he was braking almost before he saw them. Luckily for them, since they dawdled on the road as if he weren't there or had no right to be, they were boys in their early teens, a class full of them accompanied by a disheveled teacher whose long legs seemed bent up on tripping him up as he scurried after his class. "Hurry up," he cried. "Stop talking. Leave him alone. Selwyn, on the bus, all of you. Double quick." He saw Threlfall's car and held up one hand. "Would you let them cross? Would you mind?" Perhaps it made him felt a little ineffectual. He turned to the boys behind him. "Leave that wood," he cried. Or it might have been, "Leave that wood," for the three boys who were arguing about how many fish and chips they could afford were dragging what looked like a branch. They stared blankly at him and dropped it. "Not in the road, you chump!" he yelled and flung it towards the trees. It wasn't just a branch, it was carved. Threlfall could see that much before he got out of the car. He felt entitled to be outraged by the boys who piled onto the bus and were opening the windows so as to throw out the wrappers of chocolate bars, and by their teacher all the more so when he saw that the carving at the thick end of the branch was a face. Why, it must have taken days of careful work, more than you could say for too many of the books in the van. "You aren't just leaving that there," he protested. The teacher thumped on the window nearest the culprits. See here, you were told to leave those things alone. They weren't rubbish at all. To Thrillfall, he said apologetically, you can't tell them anything these days. I'd make them put it back, but we're already late. Starting right where we are. The coach driver climbed down, hands on hips, and glared at Thrillfall. He isn't a ranger, he's just an interferer. Make up your mind if you're coming. Put it back yourself if you like it round here. He glowered at Thrillfall and pushed the teacher up the steps. The bus roared away, its headlights slashing at the dim trees. Its windows spilling litter and the clamor of the schoolboys, 3 of them still arguing over 2 fish and 3 lots of chips. No, let's have 3 chips and 2 fish. Thrillfall went back to the car and started the engine. Stared at the dashboard clock, then abruptly he parked off the road and went to pick up the carved branch. He didn't much care for it now that he looked at it closely. The eyes bulged like knots in the wood. The face looked tormented, struggled to open its mouth. At least someone had felt something while it was being made, not like the hacks whose failures filled the back of the van. It didn't matter that he didn't care for it, he still had a duty to save it. Anything else was vandalism. The overcast was tattering. Suddenly sunlight picked out the trail the branch had made as it had been dragged through the pine needles. Beyond, a map carved on a board on the side of the road, a map of woodland walks distinguished by markers of different colors. He memorized the positions of the walks before hefting the branch and started down the slope. The nearest path was marked by a yellow post. By the way, folks, if you're enjoying this story, please comment below, like and subscribe. Again, here at WJUL Radio and Listening Lounge. Again, we're listening. The trail of the branch crossed the path and led under the trees. He had to slow down once the dimness closed in, chill as water. When his eyes adjusted, he saw how he appeared to be surrounded by paths, a maze of spaces between the trees. Most of the apparent paths led into long, waterlogged hollows. More than once the branch had been dragged through hollows and he had to jump across. Soon the trail crossed another marked path. It should be marked red, and when he peered along it past the glare of the sunlight on its stony surface, he could just make out that it was. Now he could hardly see the trail, even when he was among the trees and the glare had drained from his eyes. The piney smell made him think of a hospital, long, dim, deserted corridors that led nowhere. He stumbled under the weight of the branch and slithered into a hollow, ankle deep in mud. He could no longer see the trail, either in front of him or behind him, but wasn't there a stony path between the trees ahead? He had to stagger onto it before he was sure there was. What was more, it led to a building. He could see a corner of the wall beyond the farthest bend in the path. Even if the building wasn't where the carving had come from, whoever was there could take it. Thrillfall had spent too much time already in the woods. Which path was this? It ought to be the green one, as he recalled, and soon he passed a post that looked green, though with moss. Whoever was in the building would confirm the way back to the road. He rounded the bend nearest the building and nearly dropped the branch for throwing up his hands in frustration. The hut was in ruins. Not a wall was left intact, and there was no roof. All the same, the interior looked crowded with figures, too still to be people. He went forward, trees whispering behind him, his face with his knotted eyes lurching in his arms. The hut had no floor. Between the walls was planted with carved sticks that looked as if they were growing there. Not sticks, but stunted trees with atrophied branches. All had faces. Some had more than one. All the faces gave the impression of being not so much carved as straining to free themselves from the wood. He stepped through a gap between 2 walls. Tall grass snapped between his feet. If he couldn't find the spot where the branches had been stolen from, he would have to leave it wherever there was room. He held it above his head and shivered with the chill that was sharper than under the trees. Perhaps he was shivering a little at the tortured faces too. Of course, the carver must have based them on shapes in the wood. That was why they gave the impression of growing. No wonder they were so grotesque, especially the one that looked like a mother whose child's face was growing off her cheek. He turned away and frowned, realizing that there was no space within the hut where the faces could have been carved. Something else was odd. Seen from inside, the hut seemed less ruined than partially built and then overgrown. One side of the hut might almost have been a bush that had grown into the shape of a wall. Weren't those its roots in the grass? But he was wasting time. He grabbed a stick in order to lay it down when a voice said, "What do you think you're doing?" At first he didn't realize that it was a voice. He thought it was a crow that made him start and glance around, or a chainsaw, or even a frog croaking close to his ear, especially since he could see no one. "Where are you?" he demanded. "You'll find out, I promise you." Perhaps the speaker thought Thrillfall hadn't asked where, but who. Was the voice coming from the wall that looked most like a bush? "I'm putting this back," Thrillfall said. "Putting it back now, are you? Too late." "I didn't take it," Thrillfall said, resisting a nervous urge to tell the speaker to show himself. "Some children stole it. I brought it back." Himself or herself? Such a voice, one couldn't tell. "You'll do," he said. Thrillfall felt obscuredly threatened. He had a sudden unpleasant notion that someone was about to lift one of the carved faces above the wall, the face with its jaw moving. "Look, I'm leaving this here and I'm going," he said, sharply, shivering. He laid the branch down carefully, then he fought his way through the grass between the carving to the gap in the walls. Nobody had appeared. Nobody was in sight when he looked back from the bend in the path. It wasn't worth trying to retrace his route through the trees. It wasn't worth the risk. He didn't locate the trail he'd followed. In any case, the green path would soon join the red and so lead him back to the road. He turned the third bend and found that the green path petered out in the undergrowth. On the map, the green had crossed the red twice. He could only go back, staring fiercely at the hut as he passed, doing his best to shake off the impression that a face was watching him from among the crowd of carving. Perhaps one was he hadn't had time to see. He was glad when a bend intervened. The deserted path wound on. Was there anyone in the woods beside himself and the unpleasant carver? The creaking that made him glance around must have been wind in the trees. He hurried on, searching for a junction to interrupt the endless silent parade of trees, trees beyond counting on either side of him, trees massing away beneath their canopy until they merged into impenetrably secret dimness. There, a marker post in the distance, a reason for him to run, but when he reached it and stood panting, he found that it didn't mark a junction, only the path he was on, and it was painted orange. It must have been red until it was weathered. He was sure there hadn't been an orange path on the map. He must have walked at least a mile from the hut by now. Surely he had to be near the road, and yes, he could hear voices ahead, where a dog was sitting patiently beside the path. It took him 5 minutes of running, giving way frequently to jogging, before he was close enough to be certain of what he was seeing. The dog was a tree stump with a root for a tail. Then the voices began when in the trees. He let himself, he could imagine that he was still hearing them further down the path, laughing, sobbing. Movement in the trees beside him made him turn sharply, but it was a display of inverted trees in a pond, intermittently illuminated as the clouds parted and closed again. He hurried on past the sound that wasn't voices. Whatever was making that sound in the murk beneath the trees, he hadn't time to look. The road couldn't be much farther. Wasn't that a car passing in the distance ahead, not a wind? He was walking as fast as he could without running, his feet throbbing from the stony path. Must be the sound of traffic, and there at last was the junction with the yellow path. Nevertheless, he hesitated, for the sound had seemed to come from directly ahead, beyond the next bend, in the orange path that must once have been red. He shouldn't turn now. Not only was he sure where the road was, but he could see shadows moving on the path where it curved back into sight for a few yards beyond the bend, shadows of people among the unmoving shadows of trees. Thank God that's over, he thought vaguely. He almost called out to the people around the bend, had his mouth open to speak as he rounded the curve and saw the shadows were of bushes. So grotesquely shaped, they looked deliberately sculpted. They weren't shaped like people. He hadn't had time to decide what they were shaped like, even if he wanted to, nor how their shadows could have appeared to be moving. It must have been a trick of the light, but it wasn't important, especially when he looked away from the bushes. A few hundred yards beyond them, the path came to a dead end. He ran to it, not thinking, and stared into the endless maze of trees. Then he took a deep breath and ran back to the yellow path. That had to be the way. Through the path seemed to be nothing to do with the map. He ran, lungs aching, ran a curve, then another, between the trees that he could almost believe his run was multiplying, and let out a gasp so fierce it momentarily blinded him. A gasp of relief. And there ahead, where a car swept round the dim curve past the filling station, was the road. Thank God for the filling station, too. He could ask his way back to the map in his car. He didn't trust himself to judge which direction to take along the road. He looked both ways before crossing the forecart, though the curve prevented him from seeing very far along the silent road. He could see someone moving beyond the grimy window of the office. For a moment he'd been near to panic as he realized that the pumps were rusty. The filling station obviously disused. He grasped the shaky handle of the office door and cursed. The office was bare and deserted. What he'd taken to be someone was a torn poster. In fact, several layers of posters flapping restlessly on the office wall. He caught sight of a telephone on the crippled table that was the only remaining item of furniture, and he was struggling to open the door in case, miraculously, the telephone might still be working when he saw that it was nothing but a knotted stick. Were there posters on the wall? Now he peered through the dusty glass. The figure looked more like layers of bark, and all at once Threlfall was walking away. Round the bend in the road which led to a few sawn logs and a forester's hard hat. Sawn logs would have been blocking the road if there were a road, but beyond them were pathless trees and growing darkness. It was still a road, he told himself desperately. It must be a forester's road. That explained the vehicle. It had to lead somewhere. It was preferable to the paths. At least it was wider. He ran back past the disused filling station, and there, surely, was a forester, presumably the one who'd left his hat. Certainly someone was standing in the thicket by the road and watching Threlfall through the dark green leaves. Threlfall turned his back and waited for the man to finish relieving himself. Thank God for someone who would know the way out of the woods. He waited until he began to wonder if the man had been watching after all. Perhaps he hadn't seen Threlfall, but then why was he taking so long in there? Either he was breathing heavily, or that was wind in the trees. Threlfall cleared his throat loudly for returning. The man hadn't moved. "Excuse me," Threlfall said. Still no response. He walked around the thicket, making as much noise in the pine needles as he could, without being able to catch sight of the man's face. "Excuse me, are you all right?" The unresponsive silence dismayed him so much that it took more effort to step forward than to force his way through the bushes. Twigs scraped his skin. The touch of dank leaves on his face made him shiver. Twigs hindered him as he gasped and struggled backwards out of the thicket, which felt all at once like a trap. He hadn't seen the body of the figure, only its face grinning at him, the eyes bulging like sap. He hadn't had time before he recoiled to be sure, and he couldn't make himself go back to determine that the carved face bore a distorted, almost mocking resemblance to his own. He ran stumbling along the road, which gave out after a few hundred yards. He peered wildly into the depths of the trees until they seemed to step forward, and he fled back past the figure in the thicket, past the filling station where the figure on the wall was still moving, onto the yellow path. Why him? He thought distractedly, over and over. Why not the schoolboys, the teacher, the coach driver, the hack writers, the publishers, the booksellers, the bookseller who gave him back the study of English forest with the comment, "I thought this would be different from his other mystical rubbish." If only Threlfall had that book now, with its maps of walks, but it was in the van, wherever that was. He had to stay on the yellow path. It was the only one he knew. There must be a junction he'd missed. There must be a route that he didn't lead back to the hut and the tortured faces, and presumably their torturer. The trees, or the darkness between them, closed in, urging him faster along the path, yet he felt as if he were still in the darkening thicket, not running, not moving at all. He'd mistaken several trees or roots beside the path for marker posts, or figures waiting for him when a crumpled piece of paper came scraping toward him around a bend along the path. He couldn't have said what had made him pick it up. Certainly not tidiness. Perhaps that it seemed infinitely more human than anything else in the woods. He unfolded it and stared for the moment past comprehending. It was a map, a tracing of the carved map of the walks. It seemed a vicious joke, since he couldn't locate himself on it in order to find his way. He was preparing dully to throw it away when he rounded the bend and started seeing where the map had come from. A man was leaning on a stick at that side of the path. He had a long brown weathered face that hardly moved, a twisted nose, large ears. Thorofal stumbled up to him and handed him the map while he struggled to be able to ask the way to speak. The man took the paper and displayed it to him, cracked brown thumb tapping the paper to show where they were, and tracing a route right here, left, turn back on yourself. Then he handed it back to Thorofal, nodding stiffly, having spoken not a word. Something about his eyes made Thorofal mutter a hasty thanks and hurry away. Something about the way the man was supported by the stick. The route seemed more like the solution to a puzzle. Thorofal wasn't even sure that he remembered it correctly as the dark welled between the trees. Glenn snatched at the map until the paper tore. The croaking in the trees behind him began to sound like words as it came closer. First, give that here, and then, almost at his back, look at me! That was the last thing he would do. He couldn't even have looked back at the man with the twisted nose once he realized how alike in appearance the stick and the man's weathered skin had been. Here was a junction where he could see no colored markers, and he had no idea which way to go. A wind took him unawares and carried the map away down one path, and at last instinct made him flee along another, up a slope that seemed to be growing steeper, actually tilting, as he caught sight of the road beyond it and his van. He almost dropped his keys as he reached the van, almost lost them again as he locked himself in. As he started the engine, he thought that something like sticks clambered swiftly onto the road beside the carved map, croaking. All the same, as soon as he was out of the woods, he stopped the van. Bookshops he was supposed to fit in today would have to wait till tomorrow. He unlocked the back of the van and rummaged through the cartons, where eventually he found the book on English forests, published posthumously, he saw now. He saw little about the woods he had escaped except that they weren't worth visiting. Perhaps the author had felt that way to say more might attract the curious. Thorofal closed the curtains and locked the back of the van and slipped the book into his pocket. Then he let out a deep breath he had to take before turning to the photograph of the author. This was one book he wouldn't see destroyed, that he would always keep. He climbed in the driving seat and drove away, still seeing the photograph he'd already known was there, the long weathered face, large ears, twisted nose. As the trees tighten their grip, guidance can be just as treacherous. From woods to wandering, enter the guide. The used bookshop seemed to be just as useless. In the first, Q felt as if he committed a gaffe by asking for the wrong James, or even by asking for a book. The woman who was minding the next bookshop, her lap draped in black knitting so voluminous that she appeared to be mending a skirt she had on, assured him that the bookseller would find him something in the storeroom. He's got a lot of books in the back, he confided to Q, as he leaned on his stick and leafed through an annual he'd read 70 years ago. She kept up a commentary. Fond of books, are you? I read some books. Books I'd call books. Make you sneeze. Though some of these old books. Break your toes, some of these books, if you're not careful. I don't know what people want with such big books. It's like having a stone slab on top of you reading one of those books. As she sidled towards the door, she said ominously, he wouldn't want you going before he found you your books. My family will be wondering what's become of me, he offered and fled. By the way, side note here, Jen, how you liking the story so far? WJUL Radio. Hope you're enjoying it. Like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me all about it. Holidaymakers were driving away from the beach, along the narrow street of shops, the small houses encrusted with pebbles and seashells. Some of the shops were already closing. He made for the newsagents in the hope that, though all the horror books had looked too disgusting to touch, something more like literature might have found its way unnoticed onto one of the shelves. And then he realized that's what he'd taken for a book lover's front room. Unusually full of books was in fact a shop. The sill inside the window was crowded with potted plants and cacti. Beyond them, an antique till gleamed on a desk. Closer to the window, poking out at the end of the shelf, was a book by M.R. James. The door admitted him readily and tunefully. He limped quickly to the shelf and sighed. The book was indeed by James, Montauk Road James. Sure, I just read a story by him. O.M. Lit. D.F.B.A. F.S.A. Provost of Eton. It was a guide to Suffolk and Norfolk. The shopkeeper appeared through the bead curtain of the doorway behind the desk. "That's a lovely book, my dear," he croaked smokily, pointing with a cigarette. "And cheap." Hugh glanced at the price penciled on the flyleaf. Not bad for a fiver, he had to admit. Only today he'd been complaining that although this was James' country, there wasn't a single book of his to be seen. He leafed through the guide, and the first page he came to bore a drawing of a bench end, carved with dog-like figure, from whose a grin a severed head dangled by the hair. "I'll chance it," he murmured, and dug his wallet out of the pocket of his purple cardigan. The shopkeeper must have been too polite or too eager for a sale to mention that it was closing time, for as soon as he was on the pavement he heard her bolt the door. As he made his way to the path down to the beach, a wind from the sea fluttered the brightly striped paper in which she'd wrapped the volume. Flora and her husband Frank were shaking towels and rolling them up while their 8-year-olds kicked sand at each other. "Stop that, you two, or else!" Flora cried. "I did say you should drop me and go on somewhere," Hugh said as he reached them. "We wouldn't dream of leaving you by yourself, Teddy," Frank said, brushing sand from his bristling, gingery torso. "He means we'd rather stay with you," Laura said, winking at her swimsuit top, which Q could see she hadn't been wearing. "Of course, that's what I meant, old feller," Frank shouted as if Q were deaf. They were trying to do their best for him, insisting that he come with them on this holiday, first he'd taken since Laura's mother had died. But why couldn't they accept that he wanted to be by himself? "Granddad's bought a present," Bruno shouted. "Is it for us?" Virginia demanded. "I'm afraid it isn't the kind of book you'd like." "We would if it's horrible," she assured him. "Mom and Dad don't mind. It's a book about this part of the country. I'd rather think you'd be bored." She shook back her hair, making her earrings jangle, and screwed up her face. "I already am." "You make faces like that, no boys will be wanting you tonight at the disco," Frank said, and gathering up the towels and the beach toys, trotted to the car which he'd parked 6 inches short of a garden fence near the top of the path. Hoisted his armful with one hand while he unlocked the hatchback with the other, dumped his burden in, and pushed the family one by one into the car. "Your granddad's got his leg," he rumbled as the children complained about having to sit in the back seat, and Q felt more of a nuisance than ever. They drove along the tortuous coast road to Cromer, and Q went up to his room. Soon Laura knocked on his door to ask whether he was coming down for an aperitif. He would have invited her to sit with him so that they could reminisce about her mother, but Frank shouted, "Come on, old feller, give yourself an appetite. We don't want you fading away on us." You would have had more of an appetite if the children hadn't swapped horrific jokes throughout the meal. "That's enough now," Laura kept saying. Afterwards, coffee was served in the lounge, and Q tried to take refuge in his book. It was more the M.R. James he remembered nostalgically than he would have dared hope. Comic and macabre images lay low amid the graceful sentences. Here was that mysterious being, Sir John Shorn, rector of North Marston, who was invoked against ague, but his only known act was to conjure the devil into a boot, the occasion and sequelae of this being unlike unknown. Here were the St. Albans monks, who bought 2 of St. Margaret's fingers, but who, Hugh wondered, were the Crouch Friars who had one little house at Great Walnetham. Then there were the 3 kings or young knights who were out hunting and pass a churchyard, where they meet 3 terrible corpses, hideous with the ravages of death. Say to them, as we are, so will you be. Popular subject for decorating churches, apparently. Other references were factual, or at least were presented as such. Not only a rector named Blastus Godly, but a merman caught at Orford in the 13th century, who could not be induced to take an interest in the services of the church, nor indeed to speak. Hugh's grunt of amusement at this attracted the children, who had finished reading the horror comics they persuaded their father to buy them. Can we see? Virginia said. Hugh showed them the sketch of the bench end with the severed head, and thought of ingratiating himself further with them by pointing out a passage referring to the tradition that St. Erasmus had had his intros wound out of him on a windlass, the kind of thing their parents tried half-heartedly to prevent them from watching on video cassette. Rebuking himself silently, he leaped in search of more acceptably macabre antidotes, and then he stared. "Granddad," Bruno said, as if Q needed to be told, "someone's been writing in your book." A sentence at the end of the penultimate chapter. It is almost always worthwhile to halt and look into a Norfolk church, had been ringed in grayish ink, and a line as shaky as the circumscription led to a scribbled paragraph that filled the lower half of the page. "I hope they knocked a few quid off the price for that, old feller," Frank said. "If they didn't, I'd take it back." "Remember when you smacked me?" Laura said to Q, "for drawing in one of Mummy's books." Frank gave him a conspiratorial look, which Q found so disturbing that he could feel himself losing control, unable to restrain himself from telling Laura that Virginia shouldn't be dressed so provocatively, that the children shouldn't be in bed instead of staying up for disco, that he was glad Laura's mother wasn't here to see how they were developing. He made his excuses and rushed himself up into the room. He should sleep before the dull sounds of the disco made that impossible, but he couldn't resist poring over the scribbled paragraph. After a few moments, he succeeded in deciphering the first phrase, which was underlined. "Best left out," he said. If the annotation described something better than the book included, Q would like to know what it was. Studying the phrase had given him a headache, which the disco was liable to worsen. He got ready for bed and lay in the dark, improvising a kind of silent lullaby out of the names of places he studied in the guidebook. Great Snoring and Creeling St. Mary, Bradfield, Tombust, and Reckles and Snake, Herringfleet, Rattlesden, Shipley and Weeding, Bungay and Blickling and Dis, almost asleep, too much so to be troubled by the drought that he could hear rustling paper near his bed. He wondered if the scribbled phrase could mean that the omission had been advisable. In that case, why note it at such length? He slept and dreamt of walking from church to church, the length and breadth of East Anglia, no longer needing his stick. He found the church he was looking for, though he couldn't have said what his criteria were, and lay down beneath the ribbed vault that somehow reminded him of himself. Laura and the children came to visit him, and he sat up. "As I am, so will you be," in a voice whose unfamiliarity dismayed him. He hadn't come to visit, but to view him, thought, terrified of doing so himself. It seemed he had no choice, for his body was audibly withering, a process which dragged his head down to show him what had become of him. Barely in time, his cry waned. If the dream meant anything, it confirmed that he needed time by himself. He lay willing his heartbeat to slacken its pace. His eardrums felt close to bursting. He slept uneasily and woke at dawn. When he limped to the toilet, his leg almost let him down. He hawked, splashed cold water on his face, massaged his hands for several minutes before opening the book. If he couldn't reread James's ghost stories, then viewing a location that had suggested one of them might be as much of an experience. The book fell open at the scribbled page, and he saw that the line beneath the phrase had read last night was an underlining after all. It led for the next word, which was map, across the page and onto the foredge. Rubbing together his fingers and thumb, he felt dusty. He opened the book where the line ended at a map of Norfolk. The line led like the first thread of a cobweb to a blotch on the Norfolk coast, where the map identified nothing in particular, showing only beaches and fields for miles. The next scribbled phrase, however, was easily read: "Churchyard on the cliff, my old parish." Okay, I seem to have crashed. Okay. Go right on along. If nothing ever happened. Okay. Sounded irresistibly Jameson, and not to his family's taste at all. In the hotel lounge before breakfast, he read on. There was a man so versed in the black arts that he was able to bide his time until the elements should open his grave. Either Q was becoming used to the scrawl, or it grew increasingly legible as it progressed. He might have read more if the family hadn't come looking for him. We're going to give Granddad a good day out today, aren't we? Frank declared. We said so, Bruno muttered. Virginia frowned reprovingly at him. You have to say where we're going, she told her grandfather with a faintly martyred air. How about to breakfast? At the table, he said to the children, I expect you'd like to go to Hunstanton, wouldn't you? I understand there are dodgems and roller coasters and all sorts of other things to make you sick. Yes, 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 children began to chant until Laura shushed them. That doesn't sound like you, Daddy, she said. You can drop me off on your way. I found somewhere I want to walk to that wouldn't have anything to offer you youngsters. I used to like walking with you and Mummy, Laura said, and turned on her son. That's disgusting, Bruno. Stop doing that with your egg. Hugh thought of inviting her to walk to the church with him, but he'd seen how intent Frank and the children had become when she'd hinted it in company. Maybe we'll have time for a stroll another day, he said. He sat obediently in the front seat of the car and clutched his book and his stick while Frank drove eastward along the coast road. Whenever he spoke, Frank and Laura answered him so competitively that before long he shut up. As the road swung away from the coast, the towns and the villages grew fewer. The steam train paced the car for a few hundred yards as if it were ushering them into James's era. The wind rustled across the flat land under a sky from which gulls sailed down like flakes of the unbroken cloud. On the side of the road towards the coast, the stooped grass looked pale with salt and sand. Apart from the occasional fishmonger's stall at the roadside, the miles between the dwindled villages were deserted. By the time the car arrived at the stretch of road that bordered the unnamed area, which the blotch of grayish ink marked on the map, Bruno and Virginia had begun to yawn at the monotonous of the landscape. The signpost pointed inland along a road, an inn stood by itself, and beyond it Q saw an unsignposted footpath that led towards the sea. This'll do me. Let me out here, he said. Thirsty old feller? This one's on me. Q felt both dismayed by the idea of being distracted from the loneliness of the setting and ashamed of his feelings. They'll be open in a few minutes, Laura said. Boring, boring, the children started to chant, and Q took the opportunity to climb out and close the door firmly. Don't spoil the children's day on my account, he said, or mine will be spoiled as well. Now he made it sound as if they were ruining his holiday. He patted Laura's cheek awkwardly and then Virginia's and leaned back from the open window. 5 o'clock here suit you? Frank said. If we're late, there's always the pub. Hugh agreed and watched the car race away. Children waved without turning their heads, but Laura kept him in sight as long as she could. Just as the car reached the first bend, Q wanted to wave his stick urgently and call out to Frank that he'd changed his mind. 6 hours out here seemed a more generous helping of solitude than even he needed. Then the car was gone, and he told himself that the family deserved a break from him. He sat on a rustic bench outside the building striped with timber and turned to the scribbled page while he waited for the door to be unlocked. He found he was able to read straight on to the end, not least because the ink appeared darker. There was a man so versed in the black arts that he was able to bide his time until the elements should open his grave. Only the passage of so many years and the stresses to which the falling away of the land subjected the grave twisted not only the coffin almost beyond recognition, but also what layered within. Imagine, if you will, a spider in human form with only 4 limbs, a spider both enraged and made ungainly by the loss, especially since the remaining limbs are by no means evenly distributed. If anything other than simple malevolence let him walk, it was the knowledge that whoever died at the sight of him would be bound to him. He shivered and grinned at himself. Though he could still derive a frisson from that kind of writing, all the more pleasurable when he remembered that James had never believed in his ghost. Was it really possible that Q was holding in his hands an unpublished episode by James? He didn't know what else to think. He gazed along the path through the swaying grass and wondered what had led to that who had produced the description he'd just read, until the sound of bolts being slid back made him jump. The landlord, a hairy bespectacled man whose ruddiness and girth suggested that he enjoyed his beer, looked out at Q and then at the book. "Get out your way if you're walking, aren't you?" he said, so heartily that it served as a welcome. "Come in and wet your whistle, me lad." A bar bristling with decorated handles and thick as a castle parapet marked off a quarter of the L-shaped room, beyond which were a few small tables draped with cloth, and a staircase guarded by a visitor's book. The landlord hauled on the nearest handle and gave Q a pint of murky beer. "I was driven here," Q explained. "I'm just about to start walking." "Are you not using that book?" "Why, do you know it?" "I know all that man's work that's set around this countryside. He had the touch and no mistake." The landlord pulled himself a pint and drank half of it in one gulp. But he didn't find anything around here that he wanted to write about. Q thought of showing the landlord the annotation, but wasn't quite sure of himself. "Do you know if he ever came this way?" "I should say so. He signed the book." The excitement made Q grip the handle of his tankard. "Could I see?" "Certainly, if I could dig it out. What are you thinking of eating?" Q said that he'd better had. The landlord served him bread and cheese before unlocking a cupboard beside the stairs. Q glanced at the handwritten paragraph to remind himself what the writing looks like, and then watched the landlord pull out visitor's book after visitor book and scan the dates. Eventually, he brought a volume to Q's table. "Here he is." Q saw the date first, 1890. He hadn't written any of his stories then, had he? Not one. Q ran his gaze down the column of faded signatures, and almost didn't see the name he was searching for. As he came back to it, he saw why he had passed over it. The signature bore no resemblance to the handwriting in the guidebook. He sighed and then sucked in a breath. The signature directly below James was in that handwriting. Was the signature A. Fellows? He touched it with his fingertip and tried to rub the cobwebby feel of it off of his finger with his thumb. Who was this? Do you know? Whoever came after Monty James. The landlord seemed to be trying not to grin, and Q gazed at him until he went on. "You'd think these East Anglians would be proud to have James write about their countryside," the landlord said, "but they don't like to talk about his kinds of stories. Maybe they believe in that kind of thing more than he did. The chap who ran this place was on his deathbed when he told my father about that signature. Seems nobody saw who made it. It's like one of those Monty's own lines." "Have you any idea where James had been that day?" "Some old ruin on the cliff," the landlord said, and seemed to wish he'd been less specific. "Along the path outside?" "If it was, there's even less there now, and you'll have to notice that he didn't think it had any place in his book." The annotator had believed otherwise, and Q thought that was a mystery worth investigating. He finished his lunch and drained his tankard, and was at the door when the landlord said, "I wouldn't stray too far from the road if I were you. Remember, we're open till 3. It felt so like the protectiveness Q had escaped earlier that he made straight for the path. Didn't anyone think he was capable of taking care of himself? He'd fought in the war against Hitler. He'd been in a partner or an accountancy firm. He'd run every year in the London Marathon until his leg had crippled him. He tended Laura's mother during their last years and confined himself to places where he could wheel her in her chair, and after all that, he wasn't to be trusted to go off the road by himself. James had followed the path, and it didn't seem to have done him any harm. Hugh stuffed the book under one arm and tramped towards the sea, cutting at the ragged grassy edges of the path with his stick. The fields of pale grass stretched into the distance on both sides of it. The low cloud, featureless except for the infrequent swerving gull, glared dully above him. After 20 minutes walking, he felt he had scarcely moved, until he glanced back and found that the inn was out of sight. He was alone, as far as he could tell, though the grass of the fields came up to his shoulder now. Chilly wind rustled through the fields, and he limped fast to keep warm faster when he saw a building ahead. At least he thought it was a building, until he was able to see through its broken windows. It was the front wall of a cottage, all that remained of the house. As he came abreast of it, he saw the other cottages further on, and a backward look showed him foundations under the grass. He'd been walking through a ruined village without realizing. One building, however, appeared still to be intact. The church, ahead at the edge of the ruins. The church was squat and blackened, with narrow windows and a rudimentary tower. Hugh had to admit that it didn't look very distinguished, hardly worth singling out for the guidebook. Though, wasn't there a large gargoyle above one of the windows that overlooked the wide gray sea? In any case, the sight of the church, alone on the cliff top amid the fringe of nodding grass, seemed worth the walk. He threw his shoulders back and breathed deep of the sea air and strode towards the church. He needn't have been quite so vigorous. There was nobody to show off for. He had to laugh at himself, for in his haste he dug his stick into a hole in the overgrown pavement and almost overbalanced. Rather than risk tearing the paper jacket by trying to hold on to the guidebook, he let the book fall on the grass, where it fell open at the scribbled page. He frowned at the handwriting as he stooped carefully, gripped the stick, and wondered if exposure to sunlight had affected the ink. The first lines appeared blurred, so much so that he couldn't read the words thus left out at all. Perhaps the deadlight was affecting his eyes, because now he peered towards the church he saw that there was no gargoyle. He could only assume that the wind had pushed forward the withered shrub, which he glimpsed swaying out of sight around the corner closest to the sea, and a trick of perspective had made it look as if it were protruding from high up on the wall. The church door was ajar, and Hugh limped in the direction of the cliff edge to see how stable the foundations of the building were. He discerned pews and an altar in the gloomy interior, and a figure in black moving back and forth in front of the glimmering altar. Could the church still be in use? Perhaps the priest was another sightseer. Hugh picked his way along the outside building, all over the illegibly weathered gravestones whose cracks looked cemented with moss to the jagged brink, and then he shoved the book under the arm that held the stick and grabbed the cold church wall to support himself. Apart from the slabs he'd walked on, the graveyard had vanished. It must have fallen to the beach as the centuries passed. The church itself stood at the very edge of a sheer cliff now, its exposed foundation sprouting weeds that rustled in the sandy wind. But it wasn't the precariousness of the building that had made Hugh feel suddenly shaky and needed support. It was that there was no shrub beside the church, nothing like the distorted shrunken brownish shape he'd glimpsed as it withdrew from sight. Beside that corner of the church, the cliff fell steeply to the beach. He clutched to the wall, bruising his fingertips, while he tried to persuade himself that the shrub and the portion of ground on which he stood had just lost their hold on the cliff. And then he shoved himself away from the wall, away from the crumbling edge. As he did so, he heard a scrabbling above him on the roof. A chunk of moss, too large to have been dislodged by a bird, dropped on the grass in front of him. He clapped his free hand to his chest, which felt as if his heart were beating its way to the surface, and he fled to the entrance to the church. The priest was still by the altar. You could see the blotch of darkness that was his robe, and the whitish glint of his collar. Thoughts were falling over one another in Q's head. The guidebook was a late edition, and so the scribbled annotation must have been made decades later than the signature at the end, so the handwriting hadn't aged at all. And couldn't the words in the visitor's book, which Q had taken for his signature, have been a follower? The only thought he was able to grasp was how far he would have to run across the deserted land from the church to the inn. Too far for him to be able to keep up the pace for more than a few minutes. He dodged into the gloomy church, his stick knocking against the pew, and heard a larger movement overhead. "Please," he gasped, stumbling down the aisle into the dimness. He hardly knew what he was saying or doing, but where else could he go for help except to the priest? He wished that he could see the man's face, though rather less fervently. Once the priest spoke. "It brought you," he said. It wasn't just his words, but also his voice that disturbed Q. Perhaps it was an echo that made it sound so hollow, but why was its tone so eager? "You mean the book," he stammered. "Do you mean what you read?" He was almost at the altar now. As his eyes adjusted, he saw that what he'd taken in dimness draped the pews, and the altar was a mass of dust and cobwebs. More than the tone and timbre of the voice, its forced quality was beginning to unnerve him. "Your friend James thought it, but he didn't write it," the voice said. "We inspired him, and then I had to write it for him." If James had used the handwritten paragraph in one of his tales and identified the setting as he intended to, he thought with the clarity of utter panic, more people would have visited this church. He was backing towards the door when he heard something clamber down from the roof and land just outside the doorway with a sound like the fall of a bundle of sticks and leather. James nearly saw, but he didn't believe, said the figure by the altar, stepped into the light that seeped through a pinched, grimy window. But you will, said out of the hole that was almost of its face. Hugh closed his eyes tight. Panic had isolated a single thought at the center of him, that those who died of seeing would be bound to what they saw. He felt the guidebook slip out of his hands, heard its echoes clatter back and forth between the walls, and then gave way to another sound, something that scuttled lopsidedly into the church and halted to wait for him. He heard the priest's feet, bare of more than clothing, began to drag across the floor toward him. He turned, frantically tapping the pews with a stick, and shuffled in the direction of the door. Beyond it was the path, the inn, and his family at 5 o'clock, further than his mind could grasp. If he had to die, please let it not be here. What terrified him most, as he swung the stick in front of him and prayed that it would ward off any contact, was what might be done to him to try and make him look. And so the path vanishes into shadow. If these echoes haunt you, return for more on SL tonight. Felix Lubezki, Beacon in the Black. If you like what you heard and you want to hear more, like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know. I'm here. And we're, as always, listening. Till next tear. Good night.
Welcome, mortals, to a symphony of screams. Feel the rock and the rhythm as terror takes the stage. The dial tones dial up your doom tonight.
Welcome, mortals, to a symphony of screams. Feel the rot in the rhythm as terror takes the stage. The dial tones dial up your doom tonight.